Welcome to the Big Bets on Campus podcast. I'm Mike Calabrese. I'm joined by Action Network's Director of Research, Evan Abrams. We're going to go through everything that just happened in the last 4 days of March Madness, the round of 64, the round of 32, how we're looking setting up into the Sweet 16 and Elite 8 weekend. Evan, what are your overarching thoughts here? Gut reaction. We're filming this, just minutes after the Pac-12 After Dark reunion between Arizona and Oregon, another thriller to end what was kind of a lackluster week to begin with, but at least we got some drama in some of these games late. And I know that you want to talk about the Crab Five and that Maryland, absolute stunner at the end where it looks like Colorado State and the mid-majors Cinderella finally had a chance, but then they get their heart ripped out.
Yeah, Sunday was probably the most fun day. It felt like game after game. Even early with UConn, Florida, all the storylines, all the drama, Hurley being Hurley. I think it was the best day of the tournament, which, the first 3 days, or at least the first 2 days, are supposed to give us something. But in terms of just overarching storylines, favorites, again, just kind of absurd. So 6-point favorites or higher. 26-2 straight up, 19-9 against the spread in this year's tournament. But if you look last 2 years, which I guess is your NIL, might be a year or two before that, but really last 2 years, NIL era, 51-6 straight up, 38-19 against the spread, 6+ point favorites before the round of 16, Sweet 16. So, ridiculous amounts of chalk all over the place, very few upsets in certain places. And then you mentioned the other two, I think, storylines, which would be St. John's. We had talked about all the metrics kind of leading up to the tournament, about the fact that they, troubleshooting, things like that really weren't a final team. I didn't think they were going to get bounced in the round of 32, but I think they're a huge storyline. And then, the only buzzer beater so far has to be a storyline and knocks out Colorado State, which I think probably deserved the game, but those are my storylines. I'll let you kind of go from there.
Yeah, just to piggyback on some of your thoughts, the seed lines 12 through 16, only Colorado State and McNeese advance, and Colorado State ended up closing as a favorite over the 5 seed Memphis, who was without one of their starting guards in Hunter for Penny Hardaway. Probably a different game if he has a full deck. And then the only double-digit seed to make it to the Sweet 16 is Arkansas. Doesn't exactly feel all that Cinderella-y to me. They got one of the highest paid coaches in the game, a future Hall of Famer in John Calipari, and 9 of their players in their rotation were either 4 or 5-star kids, either out of high school or out of the transfer portal. The other element, though, I think, which is at least encouraging in terms of these games being more toss-ups down the stretch, is that we saw 2 of the number 1 seeds struggle a little bit. Houston was cruising in the second half against Gonzaga, and then all of a sudden, it just looked like the Bulldogs flipped a switch. They almost pull it out. They were within 3 on that final possession. Battle not able to get a shot up, so that was disappointing for them. But just in terms of Houston being mortal moving forward, certainly something to monitor. And then Florida really had a battle back, erasing a second half deficit against UConn and finally putting Dan Hurley away. That didn't seem like the layup that, at least on paper, it appeared to be, going into the game. So we'll see. Some of these matchups, we're going to dig into all the different stats moving forward as we do prep to, preview every single game in those regional semifinals. What are some of your overall trends that you've been spotting? I know that you're putting together your massive Sweet 16 article, so you're probably uncovering just nugget after nugget.
Yeah, there's a lot here, but I think looking from the past 4 days, the SEC Big Ten narrative is kind of fun. So obviously Big Ten goes 8-0 against the spread in the round of 64, 8-0 straight up. Then all of a sudden Purdue covers their 9-0. But I guess overall in the round of 32, they went just 4-4 against the spread. So a little bit coming down to earth. The SEC is the fun one. So 5-9 against the spread, round of 64 and first 4. Round of 32, they go 6-2 against the spread. But the best nugget of them all is kind of what you alluded to with Arkansas. They're pretty much the Cinderella left in March Madness, which feels a little odd. So we've had 5 upsets of 5+ points on the line in the first 2 rounds of March Madness this year. And the SEC had 3 of them, and 2 came from Arkansas. So, when you look at it from that point of view, it's just seems a little crazy that that's where we are. So I think that's one trend to kind of look for in the next rounds, as there's only a few conferences left. And then the other note is this. So SEC goes 15-7 straight up, Big Ten 12-4, Big 12 10-3. So 29-6 those three conferences facing any team outside those three conferences. Then you look at every other conference, they are 500 or worse straight up in this year's tournament, 15-38. So it really was SEC, Big 10, Big 12 kind of dominating it. And, you know, I'll leave this to you, someone who is just literally day to day with this sport while we're kind of covering a few of the other ones when the season starts. But this feels like it was kind of the whole way.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at the sport and zoom out, and I'm glad that you brought up at the very beginning the window of NIL and how that's impacted and kind of turned a lot of these mid-majors into de facto farm systems for the top programs, and really even the food chain across the entire sport. If you're a low major and all of a sudden you put together a great freshman or sophomore season, you may move up to a mid-major. If you're playing great basketball at a mid-major, all of a sudden you're a rotational player, cashing NIL checks at a power program. That's just kind of the channel that's kind of worked its way out in this sport. And this was supposed to be a year that was going to be different. You looked at the 12 through 16 seeds, 11 of those teams either won outright or a share of their regular season title and then won their conference tournament as well. So you figured a lot of these senior-laden teams that had played well together, with the exception of a team like Drake, it just didn't materialize. And I still have issues. I'm going to say this, and this affects both the big boys and the Cinderellas all the same. It was clear that some of these basketballs were overinflated. I want to say it was the Baylor game where the kid missed the dunk and it almost flew out of the entire stadium. I've been watching basketball for a long time. I haven't seen someone miss a dunk and have it go back to the opposing foul line. So I think that's clearly plays a part. You can see some of these sharp shooting teams really struggle and not get the shooter's role from the perimeter. I think that plays a part of it. But also, just in general, I do think a lot of these teams, not just being able to snipe some of the players from the mid-major ranks, but then also keeping some of these teams together and keeping kids on campus for an extra season and saying, oh, you may be a second round or fringe NBA draft pick. Well, you can stay and make $3 or $4 million and staying on campus. That all of a sudden is a very viable argument. And one that I think will be really interesting depending on how this run ends for Cooper Flagg and Duke. He's, tiptoeing around the idea of if, I don't want to go to the NBA. I don't have to because I can certainly make $10 million in NIL money and stay on campus for another year. All of a sudden, the mathematics of it start to seem a little bit enticing, particularly if you don't want to go to a particular team at the top of the NBA draft. So just some interesting things to consider when it comes to roster construction and retention for some of these top teams and how continuity really can make a difference in March. And you see it in some of these closer games. The teams that have played together longer, they certainly have that muscle memory and they know how to close games out.
Yeah, college has become lucrative. And that's a different thing than we've seen in the past, which I think might keep people there a little bit longer versus like their rookie NBA thing. But that's kind of a discussion for another day. But it is interesting to see this at the beginning of March Madness. And I think some other storylines just kind of rolling along here that I've seen is even a matchup that for this weekend, or this coming weekend with Bama and BYU. Some people look, that totals at 174.5, which at this point is the second highest total we've ever seen in the tournament last 30 years, dating back to 1995. So it's a theme we've seen with Alabama, as except for playing St. Mary's, which is more of a pace thing because St. Mary's is so slow. But all those totals in the 170s, they had 3 of them in last year's tournament. So this is kind of the first one we see in that range. But that is definitely something that will catch people's eye when they look at the board. The other thing I thought was kind of interesting, and just going through nuggets more from this weekend's action. So second half against the spread, teams who were leading at the half end up going 21-30 against the second half spread in those games. So you would think leading to comebacks, but mostly just teams getting closer in the second half. That'd be the second worst round of 32, round of 64 last 15 years. So interesting on that front is just teams weren't making incredible comebacks. Most of the favorites won, which I think probably played into it in a little bit. And one other note I'll toss you, and then just to get some more thoughts, is UK Tennessee. People have been talking about the fact that UK beat Tennessee twice. So I think that's probably something a little interesting to look forward to. The fact that UK right now getting 4.5 points, but already experienced there of beating them twice, and that's something people are going to talk about, I think.
Now, March is the best month of the year, not just for sports, but also getting the best deal on Action Pro. Right now, you can get Action Pro for just over $5 a month for the entire year. With an Action Pro account, you'll get Sean Kerner's bracket simulations, Nick Giffin's player props, and other Action Network expert picks 30 minutes before they go out to everyone else. Plus, since it's an entire year of Action Pro, you'll be covered for the rest of the NCAA tournament and Major League Baseball, as well as next fall's college football and NFL seasons. So go to actionnetwork.com/March to get on board. Any other trends that popped out to you? I know that we're still playing catch up here on Sunday night into the wee hours of the morning of Monday, and a lot to dissect. And also, I want to say this: there's some that you have to just consider small sample sizes. Even in the history of the NCAA tournament, going back to 1985 when they expanded to 64 teams, we're still not dealing with this mountain of data. And some of the games can be fluky. There can be other elements in terms of travel, in terms of location. That was something that, Stuckey and Greg and I discussed ad nauseum leading up to Michigan and Wisconsin's run in Denver, playing at the elevation, being so high and having an opportunity to, potentially have to go deeper into their bench to be able to counteract the fact that their players were gassed coming off the run of the Big Ten tournament. There's so much that goes into it beyond what just happens on the court. But any other stats or nuggets that you pulled out of this weekend's action that really stood out to you?
I think the only two other things I would have listed here is we talked about SEC, but specifically Arkansas and Ole Miss just being the only underdogs in both games, which I think is intriguing. Cal has actually been an underdog now in all three, considering he's a dog in the Sweet 16. First time he's ever done that. But if you look at Cal, 6-0-1 against the spread as an underdog, Arkansas and Kentucky. So performed well in the tournament there. And then Beard overall, 12-6 against the spread in his career in the tournament. So I think those teams a little bit frisky, and they're going to be getting points in the Sweet 16. And the other interesting one is you brought it up with Florida, but they are now the only 0-2 ATS team heading into the Sweet 16, and we've only seen one team win it all as a team who was 0-2 ATS to start the tournament. That was Arizona in 97. So a little bit of, some juju kind of working against them there, and, teams who don't look impressive, and maybe the line's inflated, so you could look into it how you will. But those are some things I thought were kind of interesting.
We're going to give you some look aheads, just, likes or leans that we have for Thursday or Friday. Some of these numbers have just popped really in the last 12 hours. I like BYU. You talked about them in their matchup against Alabama. They're plus 170 on the money line right now. This is the official Greg Waddell approved pick. Greg welcomes the second child to his family this week, and he posted that on social media. I'm shocked, given how much heavy lifting he's done for BYU in the last 6 weeks, that he did not name the kid Joseph Smith Waddell. But there's still time for him to at least throw on a nickname if BYU goes all the way to the national championship, I should say. Since February 10th, BYU 11-1 straight up, only loss coming to Houston in the Big 12 tournament. In that window, they're ranked 4th per Torvik, and notably number 1 in the entire country on the offensive end. Before that run, they were 6-6 in Big 12 play. They seemed like just an also-ran in the Big 12. And a big issue that they had offensively is that they were so reliant on the perimeter shot. They shot so much better in Provo than they did on the road. And what did they do during this 12-game run? Well, they started attacking the hoop. They went from 291st in foul shot rate to cracking the top 170. And while that may not sound all that impressive, when you balance it out with what they're able to do offensively on the perimeter, it's really stabilized their scoring. So no matter what you're doing against them defensively, it seems like they're always scoring in the 80s. And now they're going to play an Alabama team that, as we all know, they're number 1 in tempo across all metrics. They're going to push the tempo. And for most teams playing against Alabama, that pulls them out of their comfort zone. Not the case with BYU. BYU can win this game in the 80s or 90s, which is, a nice advantage for them in terms of stylistic basketball. They can win in a multitude of ways. And when you look at how they handled the 3 up-tempo teams in the Big 12, that was UCF, Oklahoma State, and Arizona, they went 3-1 straight up and 3-1 against the spread. So I feel very confident. I would take the points here at 4.5 or 5, certainly take the money line. I also think Alabama, in terms of speeding teams up, you look at other teams that they played that were up-tempo in the SEC. They swept Kentucky. That was great. But they also got swept by the Gators. Now, obviously, this is elite competition, but as I mentioned at the top, for the last 6 weeks, BYU has been an elite top 5-ish kind of team. And then finally, in terms of strategy, BYU is going to be able to throw a little bit of zone at Bama. They're top 50, rate zone defense in the entire country. But that makes things interesting, and it brings in the shot volume and the variance monster to a certain degree, because they're going to say, Bama, go ahead, shoot 35 threes. Now, if they make 12 plus, it's probably the Crimson Tide. If they don't, if they make single-digit triples, but they fire up that many, all of a sudden the math and the defensive stops start really working in the Cougars, favor in that game. So in terms of the price, I think that's the best you're going to do in terms of an outright dog winning here in the Sweet 16. What are your thoughts on the matchup in terms of a side between the Mormons and the Crimson Tide?
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm a BYU guy. I honestly wish the line was a little higher. I thought we were going to get the 5.5 of St. Mary's, but 4.5 currently sitting there. Honestly, I had considered the under. I just don't know if I have the guts at the moment to do it. And I kind of think till Thursday, it's just going to get bet up. But I would consider it 175, and just so many things need to go right for it to go over, but we've seen every Alabama game, so we get it. The other two dogs interest me are Michigan and Arkansas. I'm a Texas Tech guy, but I just think Arkansas at 5.5 is an interesting number. I think the pace they run at is kind of interesting, and I think Texas Tech sometimes can get into lulls. And Michigan is honestly is interested me, especially because Golden's played well. I had Creighton. Turns out wasn't the right side, but for a while it felt like, I was kind of onto something, and Auburn, again, hadn't looked great recently, even though playing much better competition. I just feel like, again, 7.5, it's a little high for me in that game, especially considering Michigan's playing really, really well lately. So it's not something I would stay away from. The other one I think I like about BYU, going back to one nugget there, they've also really played well in kind of toss-up games. So understood that this isn't in that spot, but either as an underdog or favorite of 3 points or less. 7-1 straight up in ATS last 8 games. So basically when they're in the mix, I think it's a good number. So I'm interested there with BYU with you.
In terms of the Arkansas-Texas Tech matchup, and as I'll continue to say for our audience, we're going to do the full deep dive this week between Stuck, Greg Waddell, and myself. But when you just look at the coaching, all of a sudden in one weekend, and this happens very often during March Madness, the narrative around Calipari having issues in the tournament, having issues sometimes making in-game adjustments. He's more of a roster creation management kind of guy. He gets the kids in there, lets them play, sometimes can make defensive adjustments, but on the offensive end, if it's not working, it's not working. And then you also look at the fact that Boogie Fland was out. Seemingly they played better, addition by subtraction. But then it reverses. He comes back to the lineup. There was concerns how he would mesh someone who hasn't come off the bench, I think they said, since junior high. And all of a sudden he's playing, and it just looks like a bonus for them. In terms of the coaching and the Boogie Fland element, how do you balance those up against a Texas Tech coaching staff that has really shown that they're adept at preparing for different kinds of teams, different looks on the defensive end throughout the entire season, particularly in Big 12 play?
I mean, I think the Fland play is good back into the lineup. My thing with Calipari is it's pretty simple. I just trust him in this spot, even though we've seen Texas Tech have some sort of success in the tournament at times, especially lately. I mean, their defense is very, very difficult to deal with. But I kind of like Arkansas's size, and I also kind of think that the SEC element here as getting points, especially, 5.5, and I think that could go up. I just think I trust Calipari in this spot later in the tournament, especially, and I have to look into it a little bit more, but I do think the prep time probably gives Calipari a little bit of an edge there, which I kind of like. And I think making it out of this side of the bracket and then having a week to kind of set up for your next tournament, which is the way all the coaches kind of deal with this, I think has an advantage there. So that's one reason I would point to Arkansas. But again, I would, probably just touch the 5.5. I think at the moment there's a chance it does get a little higher as we're kind of talking here Monday morning, Sunday night. But at least initially, that's probably where I would lean.
Now, Stuck likes to say there's different criteria that you can put out year over year. This is essentially the grouping that the national champion will come out of. You look at KenPom, you look at top 25 offenses, top 25 defenses, as well as do they have a star NBA player, or at least one that projects well in the upcoming NBA draft. Maryland is there. They're top 25 on both ends of the floor. Derek Queen just had his legacy game. He hits the game winner against Colorado State. He was calling for the ball. And Kevin Willard, who until this run during March Madness had certainly struggled to rack up wins. I believe he entered with 2 career NCAA tournament wins. Now all of a sudden he's matched that in 1 tournament run. Where are you on the Terps, the Crab 5, to potentially continue this run and upset Florida in the Sweet 16?
I thought Florida was vulnerable when they faced UConn. I mean, I tended to like the 9.5 points, and I just think Florida has some cracks in them, and I think the line was inflated against UConn. Now, I think this Maryland team kind of got a scare, and I think that scare might have done them well, as it tends to do. I think that's something interesting to probably look at, a little bit of history, and I probably will behind, you can look at buzzer beaters, you can look at close finishes, but I think a team like that, and I liked Maryland to potentially go to the Final Four. I took them at like 9-1 before they played this game. And I still got lucky there, obviously, to advance. But I think they have a chance against Florida. Now, the line, it actually has just started moving as we're talking about this, as it just moved to 6. So it's at 6 right now, which is telling you that Maryland has a shot here. I mean, it's not 8.5, it's not 9. So to me, I would have liked a bigger line. So, I mean, in terms of the current bet on the game, I think it's a little tough. I think you're probably right on there. But I do like Maryland, but I liked UConn, and we got close. We just didn't finish. I think the line's probably right there.
Another random travel quirk to consider here. Maryland sent out to Seattle to play. Now they're going to stay on the West Coast and play in San Francisco against, this Florida Gator team, whereas the Gators have to travel across the country, having played in Raleigh. Just an interesting thing to consider, how bodies acclimate, how they essentially can kind of settle in a little bit to the West Coast. We'll see if that comes up at all. Certainly elements like that can be overplayed, but at least with 2 East Coast teams, one already having the advantage and being the underdog in terms of already being out there, just something to consider.
Yeah.
Any other matchups in the Sweet 16 of the 8 that caught your eye, even, an angle on a total or player prop, perhaps?
Honestly, I'll go back to, and I said it before we went into the read, but Kentucky, Tennessee is going to get a lot of look. Just for the fact that Kentucky beat them twice, now an underdog in the game. And I actually looked it up. So back to the seeding era, like 79, 78, there is no game with conference foes where one team beat another team twice and then was listed as an underdog in the tournament. So this is legitimately brand new stuff here we are dealing with, because Tennessee is better, but for some reason they couldn't figure out Kentucky this year. So I think analyzing that matchup and figuring out, is it worth the 4.5 points, is an interesting factor, especially with, everyone talks about Barnes doesn't cover. Well, he's 1-1 right now. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, laying 4.5 again. So we will see.
That'll do it for this episode of the Big Bets on Campus. My thanks to Evan for joining me, particularly here in the wee hours of the night. We'll be back on Tuesday evening with a look at the Sweet 16. We'll also have 2 live shows this week, filling up all the player prop bets that you can put onto your card. Those will be on Wednesday at 3 p.m. and 5:30 p.m. on Action Network's YouTube page as well. As in the Action Network, you can go ahead and track that. We'll have articles that will go ahead and give you quick slips as well. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss anything, and leave a 5-star review. Good luck with your bets and all the work you're going to have to do, kind of balancing these options in the next 72 hours. Take a little breath. March Madness has more on the way, but enjoy what we just had. Cheers.